As Emmerich said, my name is Iram Heather. I'm an assistant professor of political science and environmental studies at the College of Worcester. I graduated from Georgetown in 2020. And this is sort of one of my core chapters in the dissertation now, hopefully a book later by the end of this year, trying to get into a book manuscript. This is a really nice way to introduce my work just because it is one of the key findings of this book, which is also now been submitted as a journal article. I would love feedback on where I could submit it because it is kind of this, in between sort of multi-method project, which I think really requires some kind of good framing before it finds a good home. So I'd love feedback on that. So this is one of the first communities that I visited in Karachi when I started my graduate work way back in 2017, which feels like a lifetime ago now. But this is Jannat ul Firdaus Colony, or Firdaus Colony in District West in Karachi in June 2017. And the residents of this, so just to give you perspective, that's kind of Karachi, that's sort of the highly sort of dense population in the city center. Jannat ul Firdaus Colony is sort of out here by the highway, and their highway is running across here as well. Okay, so the folks at Jannat ul Firdaus Colony are essentially looking for this. In 2017, they have just successfully been able to get the electricity company, which is K Electric, the privatized version of the sort of state-owned utility, to give them one of these. And this is called a transformer. This is essentially a step-down transformer that takes high voltage electricity and converts it into a format that you can use in your house, like 11 kilovolts or whatever, right? So I'm going to be talking a lot about, I'm going to be using PMT and transformer interchangeably. A PMT is simply exactly this. It's a pole-mounted transformer, right? So that's what that is, the step-down transformer. In order to get this pole-mounted transformer, the residents of Jannat ul Firdaus Colony started by petitioning the government for this sort of a thing. Back in 2006, they had approval from the PMLN government at the time that, yes, this is a legitimate community. They have leases on land. They have been borrowing electricity, so taking illegal connections from other places. And now they really just want to have their own transformers so they can start having metered connections on their houses. So this goes into sort of this other petition that happens around 2015. This then gets sent to the newly privatized electricity firm. There's some back and forth. This is sent on the 18th of May. You can see the date up there. Then there's this other letter that goes into the 22nd, and then there's other letters that go back and forth. They get sort of another political patron, the president of the local chapter of the People's Party over there to intervene on their behalf. That guy writes to K Electric as well. There's a survey. And then finally, in October of 2015, K Electric grants them their transformer and sort of gives them a budget and says, this is how much the Sindh government has committed to paying for this, and this is how much you'll be expected to pay as well. The really interesting thing in this actually comes to me when I was going through these archives is on the 22nd of May, 2015, the letter includes this really interesting line. And the line translated reads, previously we were using kundas, which is an illegal informal connection, for which we were paying regular bills, but now they have been cut, presumably by your employees. The people and their children are suffering in the intense heat. Therefore, we urge you to extend electricity to us as part of our fundamental human rights. The public is ready to pay its electricity bills in a just and fair way. This is interesting to me because the kunda here is an immediate admission of criminality, right? At this point, the electricity company has done everything in their power to remove these illegal connections. They have conducted huge campaigns saying that this is a criminal act to take electricity that is not metered to you. And I can show you, I don't think I have I'll show you what that looks like. It's like this. It's like basically a hook. If you see that, it's this metal hook on these lines coming, it's sort of connected close to the transformer. So that's an illegal connection, right? And so the electricity company has taken great pains to say, this is not on, you can't do this. So it's interesting to me that in the middle of what we might consider a fairly standard bureaucratic patronage sort of encounter with the state, where you have this community that is seeking formality, you have a bit of paperwork back and forth, which is typical of patronage democracies, you have a political patron involved, You have a private bureaucracy involved, which I think is a little weird because, again, if there's a private bureaucracy here, why are we still interacting with the state? We can talk about that. The thing that I want to focus on today is this act of criminality that is the Kunda. Okay, so prior to this encounter, when these individuals are using these kind of informal connections taken from other places, they openly admit that they have been engaging in these informal acts. And instead of the company kind of punishing them as defaulters or power thieves, as you know, so the company privatizes in 2009 and really starts cracking down on this kind of activity. And in 2020, more recently, they actually shared this video of somebody who has used a Kunda like this. And it is very clear from the video that this person is depicted as a criminal. The duality to me is really interesting. Why would a private firm treat informal connections as criminal on the one hand and approve formal connections to criminal communities on the other, right? So it's one or the other. Either this community is not capable of acting in a way that acts as good consumers. On the other hand, they potentially form sort of a body of, consumers who could potentially pay for bills. This allows us to ask a question which makes the first part of the study, which is how might a business see its consumers, right? So how might it see large masses of population who have been using these informal connections, who it might want to bring into the formal fold as regularized consumers? The second part of the study says, what is the impact of trust between individuals and towards the state when there's a privatization process, right? So this is a kind of a, long story, so we're going to get into this, but I wanted to just put the hypothesis of this paper out there. I suggest that when public goods are privatized, I expect levels of trust in neighbors to go down, right? Because there's a certain series of steps that takes place for the privatized company to justify providing electricity in a certain way. And so we end up with two core sort of findings of this paper. I'm going to use descriptive data to show you how a business sees its consumers. And I'm going to show you that process of seeing your consumers in a particular way impacts trust and behavior within communities themselves. Okay, so this is the outline of the talk. I'm going to briefly situate this paper in my book project and provide an overview of the theoretical framework. I'm going to provide with descriptive context for privatization in Karachi and show you some of the data that I have. I'm going to show you findings from a research experiment, which are embedded within the survey that I did for the study. Within that, I asked, what is the impact of trust, like I said, between individuals and towards the state? And again, to reiterate my hypothesis, I'm going to try and convince you that when reminded of how a state sees them, levels of trust between citizens goes down. Okay, and then attitudes towards the firm or the state remain neutral. So we'll sort of walk through this step by step. My book project traces the history of privatization of electricity in Karachi as its core sort of subject. I look at how political parties enable this process. The third chapter looks at how attitudes towards the state are shaped and how privatization can improve, some kind of participation under some circumstances, but then it's difficult to achieve in medium to low income neighborhoods. This chapter, which is being turned into an article, is does private service delivery reduce trust between neighbors? And then we have a comparative case study with other cities as well. So we're going to focus on this. Okay. So states have outsourced service delivery to private actors for a long time, right? This is the sort of finding of folks like Alison Post and Vikram Murillo, and many of these reforms are part of broader democratic processes in Latin America and elsewhere, where middle-class constituents actually demand that state-owned utilities are privatized so that you do have more of like a one-to-one consumer relationship with the utility instead of having to go through a political patron, right? So a lot of this stuff comes up organically through constituents themselves. Rebecca Weiss-Shapiro at Brown does a lot of this work too. Utility reforms are expected to engender trust and create transparency. So a lot of Veronica Herrera's work here is relevant. And yet many of them create clear losers, which is low income and working class people who might not be able to afford the higher energy and water tariffs that come about with privatization. The political impacts of privatization, I argue, are still under theorized. This is still a very new field. And I find that sort of we don't have good theories on how political impacts might sort of work. And this is relevant because we're really interested in comparative politics in this idea of patronage, right? So we're really interested in how political influence and service delivery can impact things like voting, elections, voter behavior, how it can lead to certain perverse incentives where voters vote in exchange for goods and services. But then it also forms a really big part of the state's promise to its poorest constituents that, we're going to not implement certain rules. So for those who aren't familiar with Alicia Holland's work, forbearance is this framework where a bureaucrat can selectively choose to not punish people for, say, not paying a bill as part of the state's general welfare. We'll just let it go, right? So if you're like a poor constituent, it's like, fine, whatever, we don't need you to pay every bill, right? But as privatization happens, we can assume that all this gets rolled back. So then what happens next is the question. And so just to give you an overview, I did some, I ran some numbers from the World Bank Private Participation Infrastructure Database, and it turns out that energy is one of the core core sort of things that are being privatized in low and middle income countries, right? So it's very common to see states in not just sort of medium income, but also low income countries outsource energy to private providers. And the reason for this has come to us from a lot of the economics literature, right? So we're told that thinking of electricity as a right creates inefficiency. So this is the Burgess et al. Article that came out a couple of years ago. The argument is that it makes elites and consumers tolerant of theft. There's consumption without payment, like consumption of a utility without payment for the utility. This could be concerning for long-term resource scarcity in water and energy, for example. Privatization is therefore offered as a particular potential solution, right? And the two things that I want you to keep in mind as we go forward is that privatization, if we just look at it from the perspective of like a success or failure story in Karachi, has been successful to the extent that the private company or the utility company now recovers way more than it used to, right? So recovery of bills in like the early 2000s, late 90s was like 32%. Right. And now 68 or more % regularly gets recovered by the utility firm. So if you just look at it from sort of this cost benefit perspective, yes, it has been enormously successful. What I want to show you, though, is that we don't really understand what this has done politically within neighborhoods. And the other thing I want to convince you of is that service delivery still takes place to a large extent collectively. OK, and here's sort of how, and here's why. Let's go back a second. So if service delivery takes place collectively, what we should expect is that, in an ideal world, you are a consumer of a utility firm, right? Let's say you don't pay your bill in a month. The utility firm comes and cuts off your electricity, right? Comes to your house, cuts off your meter, says, until you pay your bill, you're not going to get electricity. Nobody else is impacted by this, right? Like your neighbor is not suffering because you didn't pay your bill or you're a defaulter or you stole from somebody. That's not how this works here. You have a core base of something like 2.2 million consumers. You have 25,000 transformers. You have the numbers are staggering, right? There's just so many service delivery points happening. So this is how distribution takes place, right? So you have a utility company that is providing electricity across these, feeders like a high voltage cable. Then it goes to that transformer that I showed you in the first couple of slides. And then it goes across 2.2 million consumers just on the books. And we don't know how many more who are informal connections, right? This is how bill collection takes place. You have 2.2 million consumers and you have 30 distribution centers, right? That's it. So each one of these consumers will either go to a bank or to one of these distribution centers, right? Something that looks something like this, stand in line, get a token, wait for their turn and pay a bill, right? And in a city of 2.2 million people, where each of these little dots represents a PMT, this is the provision area. So when the utility company makes a determination of how much they collected, they are aggregating across this massive sort of landscape here, right? Or even like in a densely populated neighborhood, sort of this is what they're, there's like maybe sort of 500,000 people living in these neighborhoods or 500,000 people living in the core of the city. And that's the level at which they know, okay, here's where we're getting most of our bill payments from. And this is where, that's what the customer care center looks like. So this is kind of a more zoomed in version. And if you don't remember anything else from this talk, the thing that is really interesting to me is that even within sort of this small political constituency, which is less than sort of a mile apart, right? This is like a third of a mile apart. You can be living here and either be attached to this transformer, which has about sort of medium loss. So you're going to get about, say, 3 hours of outage every day, or you can be attached to this transformer, which gives you 2 hours of outage every day. And that may not seem like much, but then think about somebody living here. So between this red dot and this other green dot, depending on what you're connected to and where the utility company determines your provision sort of cluster is, you might be getting really good services, right? In these green sort of areas, or you might be getting like up to 8 hours of outage every single day. Okay. And that to me is a massive level of aggregation. You might be behaving in exactly the same way you always have, but depending on who you are clustered with, your life might look really different. And that's really interesting. So I expect that compliance, which is your payments, are expected on an individual basis. I, as an individual, Iram Heather, go to this care center, I pay my bill that I get every month. I get a bill in my hand saying this is how much you owe. I go to the center, I make a payment. That's my compliance, right? On the other hand, my service delivery isn't just dependent on me, it's dependent on how my neighbor Emmerich performs, how my neighbor Aaron performs, how Salman performs. There's a whole lot of us combined. Our collective behavior determines what kind of electricity I get. I call that seeing like a business. In economics, we assume that a firm will overcome information shortfalls by perfectly matching payment to consumption. I say that this is incorrect. I think that they will do this to the extent that it is sensible for them to do it. And at a certain point, it becomes too costly to go and disconnect me as an individual. So they're just going to subject all of us to outage. Yet when it comes time to pay our bills, I'm not going to go and say, hey, well, my friend Emmerich paid his bills. Isn't that good enough? It's like, no, we don't care what he does. We want you to pay your bills on time. So there's this weird disconnect. And I want to tell you that that's not a flaw. That's a feature of this system. That's the reason this company continues to be a profit-making entity, is because it cuts costs when it comes to making this perfect matching, but then it still expects you to pay as if you were this individual consumer. And so that's interesting. And I want to convince you that that's actually the design of this system. It's not like, whoops, we made a mistake and now we need to do better. It's like, no, this is status quo. This is what it is. So it's not what you get what you pay for, but you get what the business determines you and your neighbors have paid for. Much less catchy. And also, dubious in terms of, how fair it seems, but this is what we have, okay? Great, so you're a profit-making firm now. You've managed to improve recovery from 32% to 68%. How do you get away with this, right? Like, this seems like, just looking at it right now, I'm like, that doesn't strike me as very fair. So how has Karachi's utility firm post-2009 gotten away with it? That leads me to expectation number 2. Seeing like a business requires creating a narrative of theft. This is not an accident. Again, this is part and parcel of this. When they're pushing this idea of criminality really hardcore, even though they are still giving connections to people who they call criminals, right? Remember that first part that I was talking about? They're still giving them meters and PMTs and all the rest of it and getting them on the books. But from the public perspective, they are going after this narrative of theft in a really aggressive way. So there's things like this that I showed you before. I put this in my article. This was from, I think, one of the earliest examples of these kind of full-page advertisements that they would have in English and in Urdu in both like newspapers and on billboards. And this says like, when they steal electricity, they steal your life, right? This shows all these like Kunda connections up here, right? So it's like really aggressive, things like this, right? They're still going on. So this is a really big part of the utility firm saying, look, any problems you experience as a consumer don't have anything to do with us. We're trying as hard as we can to keep you safe from those criminals. And who are the criminals? Look left and right. If you do this well, your consumers will continue to trust you, you being the electricity firm, possibly at the expense of trusting others. So the winners of this process are consumers in good neighborhoods surrounded by other good consumers. And the losers are citizens in good and bad neighborhoods. And it's I was thinking about this and I kind of did this sort of unreflexively, but then I realized you might be winning as a consumer in a good neighborhood, even as you're losing as a citizen, right? And this is something I really want to sort of hopefully flesh out a little more in the paper. So, I'd love to get feedback on this, but I really think like, even if you are somebody who, lives in a really good neighborhood and you sort of get a bill that you think is fair, you get outages that are not too onerous, you've still lost that sense of solidarity and connection with people in other neighborhoods and in this sense of like, we're all in this together. And I think that is kind of a loss, even though you're sort of winning on the one hand. And then the obvious other losers from this process are people living in bad neighborhoods, so people who get stuck in bad neighborhoods. Okay, so the way, so this is sort of one of my, core sort of arguments here, and the way I translate this into a hypothesis is I say that messaging that links theft and outages will lead to a decrease in express trust in neighbors and other citizens, but it will not lead to a decrease in express trust in either political institutions or the private electricity firm. The data I used for this is a household survey of 1,019 households conducted in 2018. I actually use the PMTs as starting points, and that's really helpful because it allows us to match reported outage from the survey to expected outage from the transformer map, right? So what I did is I selected, 47 of these across Karachi. And so my survey team would start at this point over here, for example, and then start interviewing households on either side of this, right? And what that meant is that I would then say, okay, we would expect that these people should have the highest level of outage given based where they're located. So there was an embedded survey experiment, and then I did a lot of ethnographic sort of qualitative work between 2017 and 2020. Okay, so the first part of this is seeing like a business, right? So what did I find? This is what life at a low loss, which, and I'm going to keep sort of going back and forth, so please ask me if this doesn't make sense. A low loss recovery cluster means that the utility company recovers most of the bills that it expects to get over here, right? So let's say it sends out, let me show you. So at this PMT, it essentially has a meter on the PMT where it can tell you it sent out, say, 100 units of electricity, and then it's going to make the assumption that about 40% of this was recovered, or 80% of the units that we have sold were paid for by the consumers, right? And so that's what life at one of those clusters look like. They're performing really well. So you have an average monthly bill of about, 5,000, 6,000 rupees. This was back in 2018. It's a lot more now. The average household income in a place like this is, 41,000 rupees. And your hours of outage today, this was done in the summer, so there are about three and a half, 4 hours of outage are about standard here, right? And compared this to life in a very high loss neighborhood. One of the things that I found really interesting was like, what is the percentage of the bill that you are being asked to pay versus your household income, right? And this, if you divide 3,000 rupees by whatever your income is over here, this is about 11% of your income. So you're being asked to pay about 11% of your income in electricity, and we can debate whether that's like fair or not fair. That, to me, that's fairly high, but okay, whatever. And over here, it's also about the same. So it's about 12%, right? So it's not like when we think of progressive tariffs, we think that presumably these people who are higher income are using more electricity, but as a fraction of their income, they're really paying about the same as folks who are maybe using a fraction of that, in terms of in terms of units of electricity. So that to me is really interesting, is that the burden of cost of electricity is about the same on a very poor household as it is on a relatively rich household. You can see other sort of indications that this is just a generally worse place to be. You have much higher outage. You will report up to 3 or so unfair bills a year, and we can talk about what that is. Over here, it's a lot less. right? So given your value for money, it's really obvious that you would much rather be here than here, right? And there seemed to be very little explanation for why it is that even though you are getting these bills, you are still being subjected to a lot worse service than these guys over here, okay? So, the other thing I want to show you, sort of, I did this over reported outage hours. So this is what came out from the survey. And then this is by the cluster that I was surveying in. And really all of this shows is that, I can be located in an area that has a low loss PMT, but I might, it's kind of all over the map. Again, this is a bit, it may just have been in the middle of summer. Over here, it's a lot more consistent, right? If I'm in a very high loss area, I'm likely to be getting a lot more outage, but these two to me are a little more spread out. The other question I had is like, do richer people have less, electricity outage? And to me, the line, and I did this by Union Council, and the line to me is pretty flat. On sort of many counts, right? So I'll just go over this quickly. What you want to see is something like this, where the higher income you are, the less you have to deal with things like outages, right? So you want that people who are able to and willing to pay their bills have a better quality of electricity than those who don't. This is true for some neighborhoods like this one, but elsewhere, the person who, reports like the lowest income and the person who reports the highest income has about 5 hours of outage, right? So again, like it's this idea that because the level of aggregation of this is so high, you may not be differentiated from another sort of neighbor living next to you. You're being treated as these large collective blocks, okay? So to wrap this section up, seeing like a business means that at minimum, there's imperfect matching of distribution to collected bills. There's a high level of aggregation in billing data. You are not disconnecting individual customers, but subjecting large areas to outage. And you are using a comprehensive public relations strategy to rationalize this process. Okay, second part, and then we'll quickly wrap up. Okay, so as part of my, sort of qualitative work, I went and talked to a lot of people in these neighborhoods, and many of them sort of openly admit to using informal connections. And the impression I always get is that it is used as a backup because otherwise you are sitting in the darkness for 6 hours or more, right? So there's very little alternative for you to using a Kunda if you happen to be in one of those red dot neighborhoods, right? What else are you supposed to do? Because if the electricity is gone for 8 hours at the time, you're trying to run your laundromat, or you're trying to run sort of, maybe a little madrasa, or even just like living at home, right? It's really hard to imagine sitting in the heat in like 100-degree weather in the summer in Karachi, not having electricity for 6 hours at a time. It's really hard to fathom. So a lot of people say, yes, we do use these informal connections. In a more sort of well-off neighborhood, then there is this anxiety about how every time they experience something like an outage, it's because there's somebody stealing from them and they don't know why and they don't know how. And so one of the, these two neighborhoods, I should mention, Paharganj and Azizabad are very close to each other, just about a mile apart. And this gentleman who is sort of in a more well-to-do neighborhood tells me the outages here are in a very bad state. We got these tamper-proof cables last year, and K Electric told us that cabling would make things better, make it harder for people to steal. And now the Prime Minister has come to Karachi and issued a statement saying whichever area there is theft, there will be load shedding, right? Now, and he's like, well, is catching thieves our job or theirs, right? So what does it mean when I go to K Electric and say, hey, I'm being subjected to 6 hours of outage? And they're like, well, that's because your neighbors are stealing from you. And you're like, well, I think that's your job, right? Is to like stop people from stealing from you, or is it mine? Let's just be clear about that. So what I did is I turned this into a survey experiment. So very quickly, all I want to know is what impact does something like this happen on, what someone like saying something like this have on a person who is receiving this information. And so all I did is I took some statements about electricity provision in the city And then I vary who I attribute it to. So I attribute it either to the district council or K Electric. And I say that so treatment 1 corresponds with the district council, treatment 2 is K Electric. Recently issued a statement saying there should be no load shedding where electricity theft is 0. And the control is simply that most people hold this belief. Okay. And then there were a series of post-priming questions, which are the first one is an endorsement of the statement. The second one was these 2 trust questions. There was one on trusting representatives. These are all sort of taken from some other surveys. So this is like kind of the general sort of idea of like trust and institutions and so forth. How am I doing on time?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So so what I find is that there's a very clear decline in trust in neighbors after you are read these statements. Okay, and because we have a little bit of time, I want to sort of go over sort of the way I explain this in the paper, if that's okay. Okay. It is striking that individuals across service delivery groups expressed lower levels of trust in other people as a result of the treatment, right? So these are the entire sample of 1,019 people is surveyed and had this experimental sort of, had this experiment primed to them. So it's not just, as mentioned previously, the undifferentiated messaging on outages and thefts mirror official narratives about the quality of service delivery that are similarly ubiquitous across Karachi's neighborhoods and not targeted in areas where there are not more known defaulters. So this is really interesting, right? So it's not just people who are in these so-called bad neighborhoods where there's obviously theft going on who are less trusting of others. Even people who live in well-to-do neighborhoods where there's very little outage still have this anxiety about theft. And to me, that's really fascinating. It's like, but you have really good electricity. So why do you believe this statement that people are stealing all the time? And it's because there is this consistent narrative across class sectors that K Electric is battling criminals for you, right? This is their job. They're not just providing electricity, but they're also keeping the criminals at bay, right? Individuals living in low revenue loss clusters experience significantly higher quality of electricity, yet their beliefs about other people are the same as their peers who receive worse quality service delivery. The company's messaging, therefore, has political impacts, not just where theft is rampant, but also lowers trust among respondents who, in principle, should be surrounded by conscientious neighbors. Okay. So then, people have internalized messages of theft. The other piece of this is that surprisingly, it doesn't tend to reduce trust in representatives. There's a little bit of decline in endorsement if it comes from the government, but you don't seem to see any kind of significant decline in trust for your political representatives, which I find really interesting. Or sort of have any effects here in terms of whether you trust the market or you prefer the state or that. It really just comes out on neighbors. So I would summarize these findings as follows. People have internalized messages of theft. Segregation into good and bad neighborhoods has been successful. The question I have is, do middle income consumers win? And this is sort of the last part of this piece of the study, where I have an interaction term between the treatment, which is pooled, and middle income consumers. And all I show is that actually they too tend to get impacted really significantly by these messages, right? So middle income people are particularly susceptible to these messages is how I interpret this finding. So then we asked, do middle income consumers who typically live in good neighborhoods win? Maybe, or yes, but only as consumers. You have ideas of citizenship that are linked to consumption, and that you lead to a decline in trust in others. And it's worth asking whether you are still able to hold the state and its private subsidiaries accountable if you don't trust each other enough to work together with them. Okay. To conclude here, the privatization of public services is universal. You see it, you start seeing it in many different contexts, and it's therefore an important face of the state. Informal connections are a means of welfare provision, but if we believe that seriously, we should expect that privatization changes the way citizens are seen by the state and the business. There's individual compliance, but collective punishment. and narratives that link criminality to service delivery ensure compliance. They also engender low trust in neighbors, while trust in the state and private firm remains neutral. Okay, so I think I'll take a pause there and take some questions before we, or hand over to Emeric before we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm just gonna try to be quick and provide some remarks about things that I really like and things that I want to push you on a little bit more. So this is great. I learned a lot about privatization in Karachi. I learned far more than I probably ever need to know about electricity in Karachi, but that's fine. It was great to sort of provide this this background and context on the work. I'm naturally predisposed to work that talks about how privatization might affect mass behaviors and beliefs. But I wanted to sort of try integrate this into what I know about privatization more generally, both from personal experience as a citizen in which a private utility company tried to creates a market citizen, and from the larger research that we have in political science. I come from Panama, which about 20 years ago, the government privatized both water and telephone services. And there was tremendous amounts of mass response to this. And so a lot of my thoughts come from those experiences. So I'm going to make three sets of comments. One, on what the private utility is trying to do. Two, interpreting your outcomes. And three, thinking about scope conditions and how we can sort of integrate this into our large body of knowledge. So first on market and collective logics. You have this really nice phrase called seeing like a business, derives from James Scott, of course, seeing like a state. And you describe seeing like a business where private firms are hired to apply a market logic of pay to use for payment, while service delivery is collective. And this is a very particular way of seeing like a business, right? It's not like every business, it's only private utility firms. This is a cool framing. I want you to push that a little bit more and separate this. This is not just businesses, this is utility firms in particular, right? And then you argue that there was reliance on collective reward and punishment. I wanted to separate this a little bit, right? In thinking about how the utility behaves in public and how the utility behaves in private. In public, the utility is trying to construct these market citizens that are atomized, that blame fellow citizens for poor service provision, that citizens themselves are responsible for sanctioning, and the sanctioning is not explicit. But you need to be a little bit careful here because the sanctioning is not explicitly messaged as being collective, right? The sanctioning is messaged like, look, there are other people in your neighborhood who are thieves. You yourself, as the consumer, needs to find these people and punish them, right? But we as a utility company are not going to do that, right? You need to go out and do that. And then privately, as a utility company, and it doesn't seem like this part is messaged to consumers, right? They create revenue recovery areas. They're very clear about where they're good citizens, they're good consumers, they're good payers, in very high, medium, and low loss areas. And this private strategy seems to be a company trying to cost minimize, right? It's impossible to monitor 2.2 million consumers across 30 provision areas, right? But this makes sort of a difference between the public and private behaviors of the utility company when it comes to mass behavior sort of important, right? Because part of this is trying to construct this atomized market citizen, but the other part is what is actually going on behind the scenes, which is collective punishment. And this is never actually messaged to consumers, right? Or at least you don't tell us that this is messaged to consumers, right? And part of your results rests on the fact that consumers know that they're in this together, and being in this together means punishing people within their area, right? And you equate both public and private strategies as one and the same, but they don't seem to be, because these matter for how you discipline and construct citizens and socialize them into market logics. So if the business is trying to construct these new market actors, they want to make these punishments public. They don't do that, right? Or it doesn't seem like they're doing that. So maybe they are, and you just haven't shown us that they're doing this. but you want to show us that they did this. And this also sort of matters empirically, especially going back to the maps that you had, which you broke down by sort of political units. Revenue areas are highly geographically centered, right? And this matters, I'm not going to go into this, but this matters empirically when you think about clustering standard errors, in how you're analyzing the survey experiment, in how you're thinking about revenue loss areas. But it also sort of matters politically. If you know that your neighbors are good consumers versus if you know that your neighbors are bad consumers. And part of the strategy seems to fail, right? You motivated this talk by showing us an incredible example of collective action, right? You had this petition from Mahala, from a neighborhood group in which they went first to their political representative, then they went to the private utility company, together collectively to make claims as a larger unit, right? So the utility company's strategy is failing in the face of tremendous amounts of collective action. They haven't quite resisted these market logics, but they haven't been transformed into market citizens, right? And then the second thing is you actually talk very little about the other potential mass response to poor service quality, service privatization, which is exit, right? Electricity is one service, but if you have money, it's very easy to just exit from either the public or private service provision regime, to buy a generator, right? And if you could tell us a little bit about what the other mass response is, because one mass response has been collective action, another mass response could potentially be exit, which would mediate some of the findings that you have. And you also describe this as a low information environment, but then report on multiple occasions the utility company actually knowing where to remove kundas, right? And they go on a mass campaign to remove kundas. And these are highly visible things. You like hook up like an illegal hook to a line, and you can tell where people are stealing. It doesn't seem that hard for the electricity company to figure out where this is happening if they wanted to, right? And instead, this actually seems like a high forbearance environment. So you engage with Alicia Holland's work a lot, but I want to see if you could push this a little further, right? And it seems like firms actually know where this cheating is going on quite a bit. But then the question becomes like, what happens if you actually crack down? You're going to create a lot of people who are very, very angry and who are also willing to engage in collective action to express their anger, right? People tell the state and the private utility company that they're cheating. So it seems like they don't even care to let people know that they're cheating, right? This is a high information environment in which everybody is sort of very happy to be visible about what they're doing, right? And at one point you said, as privatization happens, patronage gets rolled back. But it's not clear that this is happening, right? People are engaging in collective action, they're mediating this action through the state. I don't know if they petition political actors to go to the private utility company, but it's not clear that the state should be completely absent from the story. So I want to push you on a bunch of things here. One, tell us the macro level story a little bit. What is the relationship between the state and the private utility? At times in the writing of the paper, these are one and the same. At times they're analytically distinct. But what seems to be happening is there's quite a porous border between the two. And at the beginning you said, I find it a little weird that there's a private bureaucracy involved, and that seems exactly right. It's not formally a public-private partnership, but there's certainly a relationship between the two. And it would be useful to sort of understand what that relationship is. And second, on the forbearance tip, what are the constraints that the state has to be, not the state, that the private utility has to be fully punitive, right? Like, why don't you just go out every day and cut people's lines, right? Is it because it's too expensive? Is it because they're going to have a lot of very angry consumers on their hands who are more than willing to go petition the state? Like, what is going on? What is constraining the private utility company from going out and being fully punitive? I want to turn to interpretation of outcomes. So in the experimental part of the paper, you have 4 outcomes: endorse whether there should be no load shedding, whether you trust others, whether you trust political representatives, and whether you're pro-market. I'm going to focus on the outcome which you're most emphasizing, which is trust others, and this is a core claim of the paper. and the book project. And the actual question is, do you think most people can be trusted, or that you can't be too careful in dealing with people? And would you say that most of the time people try to be helpful, or they're mostly looking out for themselves? Empirically and experimentally, this is calling out for manipulation check. I recognize the survey is baked, so I don't know how much there is you can do with that. But I did want to flag that this is calling out for manipulation check to sort of try and understand what an individual's frame of reference is when thinking about who they trust, right? Because voters might be thinking that they do not trust K Electric and the district council, rather than your average person on the street, right? When they're answering this question. And in one of your qualitative vignettes, you quote somebody saying, is catching thieves our job or theirs, right? And that seems to be reflective of a lack of trust of the private utility company, not the thief on the street, right? Like they recognize that there are thieves on the street, but the responsibility is the private utility companies for catching them, right? And if you'd given me this prompt, if you'd come to my house 20 years ago when Panama had privatized water, had privatized telephone services, and asked me that question, if you primed me to say, the utility company thinks there are a lot of thieves here, my response would have been like, no, you guys are the damn thieves, and you guys need to do more to catch these thieves, right? I recognize that it's probably not possible to do a manipulation check now that the survey is baked, but is there more that you can do to motivate that people are thinking about fellow citizens rather than representatives of the private utility company? And I buy that it's not the state, because you have the question on the trust in political representatives. But can you do more to motivate that it's representative of the its fellow citizens rather than representatives of the private utility company? Okay. And then the final thing, and I'll stop here, is thinking about scope conditions and privatization elsewhere. You motivated some of this by saying the political impacts of privatization are under theorized. I'm not sure that's true anymore. And I think you should sort of be a little bit, roll back that claim a little bit more. I'll send you a bunch of references on this, but there's been a bunch of really good work coming out recently in political science and economics that just looks at mass behavior after privatization, right? And you're right in saying that there's a lot of work on elite behavior during and after privatization. And now I think as a field, we've sort of started to think about mass behavior after privatization. And you're joining this literature, right? Yeah. And situate yourself within that literature. There's a long literature in Latin America, now in Africa. Liberia just went through, from my field, a huge education privatization. Uganda with health privatization. Situate yourself in that literature and tell us two things. Why the privatization of utilities is sort of different than other services, and why the Karachi situation is different from these other contexts. And in that way, you can sort of both situate yourself within the literature and tell us why you stand out as a result of that. And just a smaller thing in the writing of the paper, this is calling out for a really good contribution section where you just flag for the reader, my contributions are 1, 2, 3. I'm going to stop there. My suggestion now is maybe gather some more questions from the audience and then let you respond and give you some time to think through questions. So if you don't mind, unless you want to respond first.
Can I just get one thing clarified? So helpful. Thank you so much. And honestly, again, it's such a privilege to have so much focused attention on this paper because I think it really needed it. In terms of the outcome, so what you're saying is that you think that if I framed the prime in this way, that so the control mechanism, I can put this back. So the control here is, according to the available data, this is the control.
Yep.
Same statement, but many people think there should be no load shedding where electricity theft is zero. If you're in the treatment group, you are either told that the district council thinks that there should be no load shedding where electricity theft is zero. And then if you're in treatment group 2, you are told K Electric issued a statement saying there should be no load shedding where electricity theft is zero. And so what you find is that compared to the control group, both the people in the government, the district council treatment and the K Electric private treatment are less likely to say that they agree with this statement. Do you think most people can be trusted, or do you think you can't be too careful?
Yeah.
So you think this might be most people might be the electricity company and not your neighbors?
No, so the other way around, that when you say K Electric or the government,
Yeah,
you are priming people to think about replacing people there. The
Yeah.
frame of reference of people there is actually K Electric or the government or sort of elites
I see.
in
Okay.
service provision.
Okay, but then wouldn't that also happen if most people think there should be no load shedding, or is that just like it's too general, people just rely?
My concern is that we don't know which way the prime is going. Is the prime going into thinking and having you replace most people in the answer with K Electric or the district council? Or is the prime going here into having you replace, okay, K Electric is blaming most people, right?
I see.
I'm trying to
I see.
parse out which way the manipulation is going.
Because I say that this is kind of baked into the survey now, and I just have to, and of course you do this as a graduate student, and then like 4 years later, you're like, there's so many better ways I could have done this.
I've been there, trust me. I have seen. Yeah.
Something I could do to clarify, but maybe like if you would sort of dwell on that maybe and think about it.
I guess you have any other questions? Well, you have baseline levels of trust. I don't know if this is high or low. Like, are people in Karachi more trusting or less trusting in general?
Okay,
Can you compare that to public opinion data?
we do that actually. We just did this study. It's sort of did a parallel study in Lahore, and so I have findings from there on this, and I think that might be an exact same questions.
That'd be wonderful. Just
Yeah.
tell us, like,
Okay.
are people in Karachi more or less trusting of their fellow citizens?
Okay. That'd be really interesting, because it's exactly the same. Okay, that's a really good idea. All right, thank you so much. Awesome. I have a lot of thoughts, but I read some data, some questions, please.
I had a question on, thank you for this. It's very, as someone from Karachi, it's good to see some of this data and, it's expanded how I think about it for sure. You mentioned the collective example, the collective action thing that they did in the beginning. And I'm curious, if you look at K Electric, like in 2009 onwards, do you see changes in sort of, communities over time? So you see that communities which initially had high load shedding, because that's just one example. You see that over time, these communities manage to change their behavior, talk to each other. So is there a more general phenomena of what you saw in that example to show that there might have been collective action and that communities might have changed their situation over 3 or 4 or 5 year period? I'm curious about that. Or whether it was static, like communities that had high load shedding in 2009 continue to have high load shedding in 2016, right? So,
I mean, you want me to answer or just take a few?
Well, why don't we gather some more questions?
Okay.
But it's great to hear it. So it seems like the kind of, from the company or from the utility firm, the push is to kind of atomize individuals. But that there is resistance from communities and they're still mobilizing collectively. And you mentioned the kind of community petition as one strategy, but there's also periodic protests that seem to happen, which I've noticed over the last year. I don't know if that's something that's relatively new or if that's something that's been going on for longer around electricity and water and other utilities as well. And I know in Liadi there's like protests that happen. Often women are quite involved in those protests as well. So clearly they're not succeeding, but I don't know if they're succeeding or not. If you have any observations about that in terms of actually changing the way that people mobilize and making it more. And whether does K Electric actually change its own behavior in response to whether it's protests or whether it's collective decision.
And this is also very similar to Latin America, right?
Yeah.
We're out on the streets protesting against public utility, both the private utility and the government for doing the bad thing, right?
I think only in Latin America, you see much more level of citizen engagement than you see in places like, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it, but it feels to me that Latin America has much more mobilization than places like Karachi, and I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
I can jump in. So I actually had One question, do we know anything about how the connections happen at the K electric level? So what I mean is, right, so who gets to decide, or why do they decide who gets connected to the red, to the yellow, to the orange, to
Right.
the whatever, right?
Mm,
So how do those happen in the first place? And do citizens have any ability to try and say,
Yeah.
no, listen, I'm a really good consumer.
right.
Connect me to the green, it's like 2 feet away.
Right.
What do you care?
Yeah,
I'll get better service provision. And is there that kind of interaction
Yeah.
between the firm
Yeah.
and the citizen's behavior?
Yeah.
The other question that I have picks up from sort of Rehan's question, which is why you want to tell us that citizens' belief in the market doesn't go down,
yes.
right? They don't
Yes.
dislike
Yeah.
the market. They think the market is great. There's no problem.
Or they're neutral towards it, right? Like
Right.
that's, yeah.
Like no one seems to be thinking it's privatization that's crap,
Right, right.
that we're getting shafted as a result of.
Yeah.
So, right, whatever, where's the, that doesn't seem to
Yeah,
happen.
yeah.
In which case, why don't we see more, and this picks up a little bit and maybe develops Rehan's point, right? Why don't we see more efforts where people organize their neighborhood and say, look, whatever the price differential is, that, I mean, you are paying your utility bills, right? But we can, I'm a private sector actor in the community. I know the 200 people who live here. How about I get you electricity from, whatever, not for 8 hours a day, but for down to 2 hours a day, and pay me this difference. Like you're paying the same thing, right?
Mhm.
But our collective behavior, like our collective outcome, is going to improve massively as a result. So why are there not more people organizing at that neighborhood level
To get bills paid for K Electric?
to figure out how to get enough compliance,
Right.
but cut their losses down massively? Like there looks to me like there's a massive arbitrage opportunity here.
Yeah, yeah,
And people don't seem to be against privatization.
yeah,
They like the market. They're not going, no market, right?
yeah.
So why isn't someone hacking into this arbitrage and, I don't know, getting like rich in the process and,
Right.
being the savior?
Yeah. It's good.
Karachi seems like a pretty entrepreneurial city. Yeah.
So, yeah. Who are those people?
So, can I just take, can I take some of those? So Aram, I'm gonna start with yours. When is the last time you knew 200 of your closest neighbors? Right.
That's not the point,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The point is it worth my time to get to know them, right? I'm somebody who's saying, actually, you know what, I can earn from this.
Yeah.
And it's worth my time doing this. So, let me go figure out, get 6 people in the neighborhood and say, look, guys, we can actually be doing much better
Right.
than our crappy situation.
Yeah.
Why?
No, and I think that's really important, right? Because that was one of the things, is that, is there an opportunity? Now, imagine this is a highly densely populated neighborhood. And I wish I had the map of like actual household, houses at this level, but like, this is like a third of a mile, right? So this is sort of the neighborhood of this is Old Town. I think this is Gazdarabad, Ganjipur. So I've spent like a lot of time in these neighborhoods, very, very densely packed, sort of multi-story buildings. It is very hard to get to know everybody in the neighborhood. And each of these dots represents hundreds of consumers, like hundreds and hundreds of consumers. So first you've got to figure out, as you are saying, which dot you're connected to. Okay, so let's say you're right here. You should be able to figure out fairly quickly, and people have told me this, oh yeah, we get 8 hours of outage because hamara PMT wo wala hai. We have that bad PMT back there. We're connected. Although we live in this good neighborhood, we're connected to the bad PMT. And so, okay, fine. So you happen to live in the good neighborhood, but you're stuck in the bad PMT cluster. What do you do? Okay, so you've got to figure out 250 people, 300 people living around this. Either you get yourself put on the good PMT, right? So then you individually petition K Electric and say, hey, look, I think you've got the wrong guy. I pay my bills. I'm not like these fellows. Why don't you put me on? They may or may not entertain you. Why? Because if they put you on to this PMT, it increases the load for this PMT, right? And PMTs have a kind of cap at how much they can, you can't just have hundreds and hundreds of consumers attached to one transformer. There is a limit to that. Okay, so let's say that didn't work out. Let's say you try to get to know 300 people in this neighborhood. I think it's really interesting because in some ways, I do think this gentleman has given us the answer to this, is that the flip side of saying, is catching thieves my job or theirs? It's like, is improving behavior my job or theirs, right? Is getting 200 or 300 people to do the right thing something I, as a working class person with a full-time job, can reasonably take on? And there does seem to be some, in fact, it's funny, I met Alicia Holland yesterday, and she asked me, she's like, well, why didn't the political sort of party step in here? Like, political entrepreneurs do this kind of work constantly, right? And the fact is that, and Nidha will correct me, but when I was doing these interviews, there were certain political entrepreneurs that were given like TICAs or kind of given sort of areas to do this kind of bill collection from on behalf of K Electric. And within 3 years, they were like, please don't ask us to do this. It is politically damaging for us, right? Because when we go around, when IREM goes around door to door saying, listen, we got to all pay our bills and things are going to improve for us, right? It's like, all right, let's improve our compliance, and then K Electric, and then you do these petitions and you go back and forth and nothing happens. Let's just say that there is definitely an opportunity here. And I think there's a really important point that, even Emmerich made about how mass action does work now. I just didn't see anybody in a meaningful way. I think like context to context, this was different, but I didn't see anybody in a meaningful way say that they had any faith in the utility company updating their priors, even in the face of good behavior. And then the next question becomes, how long will a consumer perform well in the face of bad punishment, right? So what is your tolerance? Is it like a month, 2 months, 3 months? And then you're like, my God, I am paying 11% off my monthly income in utility bills, and I'm still being subjected to 6 hours of outage. This is unfair. Screw this. I'm not doing this anymore, right? So you're kind of doing this dance of exactly what you're saying, is that to what extent is the utility company motivated to bring even collection up to 100%, right? Because to me, if this is the status quo, this means that the punitive action that they're taking is, you're right, they're not going to these bad neighborhoods that are obviously stealing and taking down electricity. They're just like, right, they get 8 hours of outage. We don't spend as much money on them through service delivery as we would in a really good neighborhood, right? And that too is kind of baked into the process, that you do have these energy shortfalls. So anytime there are outages, and there are outages throughout the year now in Karachi, you just prioritize people who or think are paying their bills on time, or clusters of people who you think are paying their bills on time versus those who are not. I really appreciate Nidha's question about mobilizing collectively. I do wonder if this is a post-2018 phenomena, right? And I think like a lot of the things that you guys are mentioning, Rehan, Aram, like these are really valuable things. And I think it's almost like you can't fool all the people all the time. This is until 2018, the utility company was doing a really good job of directing anger horizontally. But I think like in recent years, maybe some of that anger has been directed vertically. We've had now 2 major breakdowns countrywide, but specifically in Karachi, it's so galling because you're like, okay, the grid went down in the country, but I'm paying way more than people in other cities are paying. Shouldn't there be some kind of protection for this group of consumers? And so you have started seeing a lot more mobilization. I just don't know if it's consistent enough, and I don't know if it's becoming a problem for the political parties in a way that it would need to in order for things to change. But I think it certainly is true that it's been like 5 years almost since this survey, right? So these things are constantly evolving, and I think it maybe deserves its own chapter to see like what the current state of protest is, and even compliance, right? I'd be really curious to know, if I were to do a survey today in Karachi, how many people say they continue to pay their bills on time, even if they're treated really poorly,
I mean, this seems like an unsustainable equilibrium.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
If the utility company is not updating,
yeah,
and I continue to pay my bill on time,
yeah.
and get poor service, I'm just gonna stop, right?
Right, but then you also won't be getting electricity. So for them, it still makes sense. Does that seem true, right? This idea that like, sure, so let's say you started out as a neighborhood of 100 people.
Mhm.
And maybe 40% of you were honest citizens and you paid your bills on time. The electricity company determined that you're a poor performing neighborhood, you get 6 hours of outage. Eventually, even that 40% shrunk to 20%. You're still getting like 6-8 hours of outage, so they're not spending a ton of money on you. They're maybe collecting whatever they can. It's just a low equilibrium outcome, and it's an open question. You're right. How long does that stay? And then what is the tipping point at which somebody intervenes and said, we can do better? Because what I don't see is any kind of elite political behavior that is now saying, oh, we need to renationalize. It's almost like we've created these silos, right? And this is another thing that you might see in these contexts, is this kind of siloing of neighborhoods, right? Where if you are living in one of these like nice green neighborhoods down here, you're fine. And then if you're up here, and these kind of like empty out, it's almost like and this is again, something I thank sort of Alicia for this point. It's almost like food deserts in the United States, right? Like these places drop in value in terms of their property. People move out of here. They try and move to these other neighborhoods that have better service delivery, right? So they just kind of become kind of slum areas, right? And these other neighborhoods become high value. For those of you who work on water in Karachi, you'll know this, that one of the key things that somebody asks when they're buying or renting a house is, where does the water come from, right? And whether your water is provided by the state or whether it's provided by private tanker will determine how much rent you are willing to pay for this, right? So you can imagine similar things happen with electricity. Suddenly these neighborhoods become like very high value in terms of rents and in terms of people wanting to move in here. I actually didn't see a ton of people able to move within the city because I'm sure it's expensive. But that's one possible explanation for how the status quo remains, is that these just remain poor, under institutionalized. People don't resort to any kind of collective action, whereas these become a lot more sort of competitive and sort of kind of become like the desirable areas to live in the city.
Well, so I don't know Karachi very well, but also like, how much of this already maps onto socioeconomic inequality in the city to begin with, right? How much is it not necessarily people moving, but the utility company being like, rich people are going to pay, so let's just give them the services to begin with.
Right.
And poor people are not going to pay, so why bother?
Yeah.
And poor people are also less likely to engage in collective action at the
Right.
level.
That's right. No, I think so. I have another sort of. I think it's hard to ex ante make that determination, because you did have, we don't have that kind of granular data from, basically the last census was, back in the 90s. So you can't, even if I say that right now, this is a pretty poor neighborhood that was always kind of poor, it still had enough of a presence of sort of a working class group of people who were PPP voters, right? And so it might be poorer than it was before, but I think a lot of these neighborhoods were a lot more mixed, and I can sort of assume that there is a greater degree of segregation along class lines that would happen after you have something like this kind of collective action or collective punishment take place, right? It just intuitively makes sense that you would try and segregate, or you try to sort yourself into a better neighborhood, right? But yeah, you're right. Definitely, I think like these neighborhoods were always very working. This is sort of the this is sort of the heartland of PPP support. This is kind of the area in the heartland of PPP support in Karachi. So yeah, generally very working class neighborhoods, but now even more abjectly poor, if that makes sense. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
I had a question in terms of if we compare the sort of Karachi to other cities.
Yeah.
Like I was recently reading a case on the Delhi's privatization in
Yeah.
the mid 2000s.
Yeah.
And to what extent, I mean, you're like the assumption of seeing like a business is that if we try and get billed at the individual household level, it'll be too costly to make the business work, right? But
you'll get bills at the household level, but turning off electricity
would be very
yeah.
costly, right? If you look at the way that like the privatization took place in other large cities in South Asia or other countries, do we see a similar model of this
Yeah.
collective thing?
Yeah,
And
That's
is
a
the
good
experience
question.
similar or in terms of what the aftermath of that
Yeah.
was?
right.
So how do you situate Karachi in the broader context of private?
Meera Maha didn't work on this in a couple of large cities in India, actually looks at how the bureaucracy stayed kind of within the state, right? But somehow there was I think more pressure on the bureaucracy, either because some part of it had reformed or something to collect more bills. And in that case, like you just had a bigger base of bureaucrats going into these neighborhoods and making these determinations, right? One of the things that I discussed this in my second chapter, one of the big processes of cost cutting with this privatization firm was, of course, to lay off a lot of people, right? So
Right.
about 3,000 street level, what we call street level bureaucrats were laid off. So presumably somebody who would, even whose job it would be to go into these neighborhoods and do exactly what you're saying is to say that, actually, I think this house is mislocated, right? These are like good, honest consumers and they are valuable. Let's just see from a, economic standpoint, they're valuable consumers. They belong over here. You've put that onus on the consumer now. You've made them assert themselves as good consumers. You've taken out the costly processes with you going into the neighborhood and being like good citizen, bad citizen. It's like, if you're a good citizen, come to me and show me that you are, right? Just demonstrate to me that you're good. So, so I think like doing this, and I think this is where the scope conditions come in. There are so many different ways in which states can privatize, and this is a really specific example of how they've done it. And so you're right. I've actually found, I think in Tanzania, there was an example of this, where again, the state outsourced to these private firms, and then it expected people to comply. And exactly the same thing happened, is that they complied for a couple of years, and then they got really annoyed that, we're complying and you're not doing anything, you're not keeping up your end of the bargain. But seeing something like this, I think I'd be interested in finding other parallels, right? I think with India, a lot of the bureaucratic structure that collects the bills has stayed in place, even if the generation or distribution networks are privatized. So I wonder if that sort of makes it a little more sort of, because this is like the front facing, and I really love this picture, right? So you're sitting in this thing that looks like a bank office, right? Paying your bill.
Right.
And you're basically being told, yeah, there's nothing we can do,
Yeah.
This guy, right? So I realized sort of sitting here taking a token, you're kind of waiting around, right? This is not how patronage works. This is very like the sanitized, like private, this is like the face of the private utility company, is that you will be treated as a consumer on the merit of your own performance. But then of course, when you kind of, pull back the veil, the private utility company also can only differentiate between good and bad consumers to the extent that it makes sense for them from a cost standpoint. But I also, Rehan, I take that point really seriously, because I also don't want this to just have its own internal logic, right? Like it needs to resemble something in other places. Otherwise, this is just how it works in Karachi, right? So I want to have I think Emmerich who brought this up is like, this is seeing like a business in Karachi, but I do want it to speak to seeing like a business more generally, right? And which is why I brought in sort of Tanya Winter's work in Tanzania. I brought in, the Delhi and Kampala examples of how like, electricity firms would get groups of women apparently to go around and like try and snitch on each other. I take your point so seriously, right? Because it's like, on the one hand, we've been doing or studying political entrepreneurship in these contexts for decades, right? But then you think of like what I would have to be convinced of in order to put myself out there as a liaison between a private utility firm and the consumer, right? I would really have to be convinced that the utility firm is going to listen to me, because otherwise, why would I do that to myself? Like it would just kill my reputation if I am recruiting 300 neighbors, making them do a thing in expectation that something will be returned to them. Clearly, this has shown that the utility company only can go so far in keeping those promises as well. So that to me becomes the piece which I'm kind of wrestling with right now. It's like, to what extent are they also acting rationally, in this way? Yeah.
So I think what I'm concerned about is that quote that you showed, right?
Yeah.
So are people, have they internalized the moral argument,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
The thief argument. So supposing K Electric is doing a really good job of saying, you know, you're surrounded by thieves, which is why we can't do anything to help you.
Yeah,
Presumably, okay? So have people internalized the thievery argument
right.
in their neighbors
Mhm.
instead of saying, wait a second, maybe the thieving framing is what is our block.
Mm,
There's a lot more that we can do here.
mhm.
What if we're not thieves? What if we're just a little smarter about it?
Yeah.
And I mean, from what I'm hearing from you is, no, everyone seems to have just internalized the fact that they're surrounded by in a sea of thieves
Yeah,
and that they're helpless.
yeah.
Now that's obviously, I mean, just as a human being, and that's pretty like right. That's like your classic right frog in a whatever bucket,
Well,
right?
yeah, sort of thing, yeah.
And that's incredible that that's something that has penetrated so deep that it disables.
Yeah,
Instead of saying, no, there is an opportunity here. What if this framing is a problem?
But even if they haven't internalized the logic that everyone is thieves, that could be one argument. The other could be that they don't know the threshold
Mhm.
at which they need to wait. So for example, if they knew that if you just convince these 500 households,
Right.
you'd be able to improve your lot. But they don't know whether the number is 500, 200, 900. So there's like helplessness coming from the lack of what they need to do. It's not like a clear, I mean, it's an arbitrage opportunity in sort of in theory, but we don't know they don't know the transformer economics like that.
No, so in a lot of environmental justice communities here, right, and in places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, one of the things that happens is that people think very hard about. Now, this could be engineering students. I mean, I don't know, electricity, okay? What they're trying to figure out is what would this community need to know
Yeah,
technically
right, right.
that they can then be mobilizing people,
yeah.
agitating or arbitraging.
Yeah.
So that we don't see any inkling
sign of,
of,
yeah,
because that would solve the
Well,
problem.
this is the issue, right? So I really like this because it's like, it does everybody in Karachi, what would it do if everybody in Karachi had access to that? That's what I want to know, right? And that's something I really, and I mean, Nida knows this because I was doing this when she was sort of doing her fieldwork in Liari. The way I got this map is I think like I went to so many different people in like the higher echelons of K Electric. And I signed all these non-disclosure agreements and this and that. And then I think like finally I found this like very sweet like geographer sitting in their GIS department. Just like, I want to show you something really cool. And then he would send me like these big zip files on WhatsApp and be like, and I'm like, you're amazing because everybody else has denied me. And I think what he secretly didn't know that I knew what this was. And he was hoping that like, I just wouldn't be able to figure out how to do it. But he just wanted to show off that he had really cool data, But the idea is that why was it so secretive? Like, if this is the strategy you're following, wouldn't it just make sense to like publish this every month in, I don't know, have a website or something and say, this is what compliance in your neighborhood looks like. And to me, that's because like, you might be held accountable then, right? You might be like, actually, I can, these 500 people show up and are like, we actually paid our bills. So why are we still attached to the silly red dot? Why are we not on that green dot now? So it's really interesting. It's like, why isn't this publicly available, right? What's the story here?
Right. And one of the things that's been done here, right, is where on your bill, I mean, anybody who gets a bill or water utility bill, right, you could see this. Relative to last time this year, how are you doing?
Yeah.
And relative to all your neighbors, how are you doing?
Oh, really? Okay, right.
It's a fascinating component of your electric bill, your power bill, your every bill, right? Your utility bill, your water bill has this. So that's definitely something that public service provision it has moved towards. And one of the people who was this was the Office of Regulatory Affairs, OIRA. Right, that Cass Sunstein also headed at some point, right? But they were really trying to look at, if you publicize how is everybody around you doing, how does that change behavior? And that's now become a standard part of utility bills, as I understand.
To me, that's a scale issue, right? This to me is just like, how does this even work, right? It's kind of what you said. It's like monitoring 2.2 million consumers from 30 distribution centers is crazy enough as it is, but then trying to meaningfully communicate to them that they could do something in their behavior, unless they literally move to another neighborhood, right? That really is the one thing you can tangibly change that will improve your service, but then that doesn't really resolve the issue. it does mean that you're kind of stuck. The other thing is that, so I have this data for 2 time periods. I have it for 2017, 2018, and then I think I had the 2020, but then I wasn't quite able to match the points, but it doesn't change that much. So it's not like they're going out there and updating like thousands of transformers based on good behavior. I think there is a capacity issue, right? I think that this is about where it's at, and I don't know if there'll ever be a situation in Karachi where you have 100% compliance and 100% service delivery, right? And that's sort of what the scope conditions of this I don't know if this paper, but also of the book really need to address, is that ultimately we are in an energy scarce country, right? And so can we imagine a world in which every single citizen in Karachi pays for premium electricity, gets it 24/7, and there's no outage? You know, I don't know if we would ever sort of be in that universe.
So I have a couple of questions that have
Sure.
emerged out of sort of the conversation, or answers to the conversation. So first, I'm curious as to what the claim making repertoire is available to the average citizen in Karachi. Right. So in answer to Alicia's question, political parties are not an avenue for claim making. My understanding in Karachi is the PPP is super strong, but
Yeah.
not here. In answer to Tarun's question, neighborhood associations are not a way that you can make claims on private service providers. It seems like you can't go as an individual to make claims on private service providers, because what you get is this very sanitized and like clean looking hall in which you pay your bills. So if I'm a citizen and I want to make a claim on the private utility company, what are my options?
So this is really interesting, because exactly this neighborhood, Ganjipara here, has this kind of really interesting nexus of like highly educated, but also sort of working, you know, not like very high income. There are a lot of like school teachers here. So a lot of the women in this neighborhood were school teachers, and they have very strong anjumans because of a history of sort of associational life in this area. They all belong to the same sort of extended family. There, and this happens in several places. If you have a neighborhood that's kind of old and has had these family sort of ties, your anjuman might be a place where you might sort of talk about these things. In chapter 3, which I did, where I presented at MPSA last year, and I think like Emmerich was on the panel. I think you were a chair in that one. I actually talked about that neighborhood as being kind of this like this success story, precisely because they not only improved their bill collections, but they also insisted to K Electric that if somebody in our neighborhood is stealing, I don't want you to go after them directly. I want you to come to us. So I want you to come to the Anjuman and say, hey, this person in your neighborhood is stealing from us. Make sure you do something about it, or there's going to be collective repercussions, right? And then they would negotiate with that person. So, and that to me has to be this nexus of, Partha Chatterjee and others sort of do this work. It's like, it has to be somebody who's not, it has to be an association that isn't tied to a political party, because that then has its own dynamics. It has to be internally, have its own internal logic, right? And I would love to have like a map of those kind of community organizations in Karachi that we could map onto this. The other place that people tend to go to is the federal ombudsman. So energy is this federal subject. There's an office in Karachi where you can go and have petitions to essentially the state, which acts as a consumer protection entity, and say that I've been mistreated by this private firm. Can you do something about it? What's really interesting is that the federal ombudsman back in like 2017 got this reputation for entertaining these cases. And then when I met this guy in 2018, he's like, I am overwhelmed with petitions. I don't know how word got out that I can do something about this. And now I can no longer do anything because of the sheer volume coming my way. It's like, if I get 1 or 2 petitions, maybe I can make a case, right? And I can go talk to talk to whoever it is and make sure there's some paperwork that happens. After one person got successful at that office, suddenly hundreds of petitions start coming in. And then this dude is like, whoa, I can't do all this, right? This is too much. So it's interesting both ways, right? It's like people will try anything, word gets around, And then the capacity for that office to do anything just depletes itself. It's so funny because at that point, the NEPRA, which is the federal entity, created a designated office for exactly this in Karachi, because like, oh, the federal ombudsman is getting overwhelmed. I went and visited that office, and it was like one guy with a laptop somewhere sitting like in a government office, and he's like, yeah, I can't do anything about this. Please stop asking me. Right. So it's like not only, and you can imagine the state also has to toe this line, and this happens in India. This is sort of again, Mahadeva's work too, and Burgess's work, is the state also cannot be too interventionist, because once you sell to a private entity, you want to guarantee them that it's worth their time to be there, right? So if you take on this role as a consumer protection organization, suddenly the private entity is like, this isn't working for me, right? I'm not making any money here. Things are being caught up in court constantly. This is also like Alison Post's argument in Argentina, is that foreign firms would invest in water utilities in Argentina, and then they would go away because they're like, the courts just come after us, and this is just not worth our time. And so the people who would actually do really well were domestic water firms. You know, so I think there is interesting parallels of this in other contexts as well. So yeah, in terms of like who does one go to, it really depends on how, you know, what level does the government set up that you can actually sort of, you know, make petitions to this private firm.
So I wanted to ask another question here online. If I am a completely unsophisticated private utility company here, I would just randomly decide where to have high and low loss areas, right? But there seems to be some strategy in doing this.
Yeah.
There's geographic clustering. And if you just look at the summary statistics of the quality of electricity across sectors, high income places seem to get much better service than low income. So they have some information. How are they deciding? Like, what is the first heuristic that they use in deciding who would we treat well and who would we treat poorly?
That's sort of what your question was as well. I think the first port of call, I think I put this in my paper as well. I think large industries and large consumers were the obvious places to go, right? So if you have this neighborhood, for example, down here, if for those of you who are familiar with Karachi, is kind of like the new development, which has a lot of posh sort of houses, and they're, you know, it's fairly regularized. This is sort of like, you know, where my mom lives, just for context, right? So we're right here. This is kind of Defense and Clifton area. These are known as like the good neighborhoods, but more importantly, you can see that each of these has its individual block, right? There's a meter. People here are typically, you know, running like, they have like 5 or 6 bedrooms. They're running an air conditioner. They have a lot of electronics, right? Cutting one of these consumers off saves you a lot of electricity, right? It is a significant change in your output. So what you start doing is convincing all of them, basically by saying, we're going to cut you off. So they spend a lot of time making sure these consumers pay their bills, because it actually does make sense to cut them off at the individual level. The next thing they do is they target industrial areas over here and here. And again, large industry, if you're defaulting on your bills, if you stop sending electricity to that industry, it is going to save you a lot of units, right? So you are doing, so once you start regularizing these large consumers, your next step is, okay, what are the other neighborhoods that I can do this in? And typically it is where you aren't going to face a lot of risk in terms of mass mobilization. It's people who are willing and able, but maybe just haven't been doing it because no one does, right? Like, you know, like my parents can afford to pay their electricity, but they're just like, well, who pays electricity, right? It becomes one of those things. But it's fairly easy to convince like 2 doctors living in an apartment building. It's like, hey, pay your bills because everybody else is paying your bills, right? And I think that's the first sort of cut off this. And then really what we are seeing right now is really the last piece, was it's like, you know, we've tried and there's no way to convince this belt to pay its bills. Right, we did good work here, and we kind of did good work here and here, and now it's just, these are like really small, like clustered neighborhoods. They're like you know, they're all permanent, but they're like slums. There's a lot of theft. The roads are not very well maintained or anything. And this is just, we're kind of given up, and this is our limit, right? But you can see this kind of creeping sort of making an effort to separate people into good and bad neighborhoods to begin, and it took a long time. So this process started in 2009. I'm studying this in 2018. So you can imagine there were waves in which this kind of segregation and sorting was happening.
All right.
And just like the last thing that you were saying to pick up, right? So a lot of the better off, right? So they can do the exit part.
Yeah,
So they can do solar panels or whatever, right? So,
Yeah.
and that's
there's very little examples of that for some reason. I guess
Generators?
generator,
generators is a huge thing.
but
But it-
how long, right?
So what generators do is do the top up power,
Yeah,
and it's very few people with large enough generators to just like run and run and run. Because
Yeah.
again, there's a huge cost to operating those,
diesel and gas, it's
right? Like where they get all the AC
Yeah,
and blah,
yeah.
blah. But what is interesting to me is that the solar panels and how
Yeah.
expensive they are also mean that they're not a lower income
Yeah.
exit strategy
yeah.
yet, because it's just not
Yeah.
possible to do that.
Yeah. No, it'd be interesting to see, like, if we do end up going in this direction where we start like heavily subsidizing solar, who takes it up, right? I know that there is some push towards solar sort of out here, right? Especially where you, it's kind of like, this is the, you know, that community I showed you initially, right? A good alternative for them, instead of trying to like petition K Electric to give them a regular connection, would be, okay, you know what, let's just all chip in and buy a solar panel and then power these 100 houses. The scale is not as great though, but maybe I think I have seen some shops actually for solar way out here. But otherwise, if you're kind of in the middle here, like imagine if you're just somebody living in one of these like really cramped neighborhoods, your ability to exit is kind of limited as well. Like, what are you going to do, right? You're like a little apartment in the middle of this dense like apartment sort of network.